Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP Exam Review. And today we are going to be covering Period 7. Period 7, I am doing a video on it all by itself because Period 7 is the largest as far as time periods and has a ton of information as part of it. It starts in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and then goes all the way to 1945, which is the end of World War II. And there is a lot that happens within this period. With the Spanish-American War, you're going to have a U.S. expansion overseas in the period of U.S. Imperialism. You're going to have the progressive movement that takes hold here in the United States with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and others that lead the way in that. Then you're going to have World War I. Then you're going to have the 1920s and the Roaring '20s, then the Great Depression that happens, and then World War II. So there is a lot of information, and this is really kind of a foundational part to where the United States grows and kind of becomes in the 20th century as a nation. Just like the previous periods that we have covered before this, as far as the exam makeup goes, you're going to see that Period 7 is 10 to 17% of the curriculum. Now, as far as essay topics, you're going to see, because this is such a big part or time period, and because it is so foundational, you're going to see that the essay topics really could range on a lot of different things. For one, the Spanish-American War, the Progressive Era, the Great Depression, New Deal, World War II, really any of the big topics from this era could be covered in an essay question. Really, with those specific things, I would focus on like what were the accomplishment of the progressives, how did FDR respond to the Great Depression through the New Deal, what were some impacts of the New Deal, World War II, what was the impact of World War II, especially on minorities, on women, and other special groups such as that. So look at that throughout this period. That's the second there in essay topics that they could possibly be. Change and continuities for immigrants, African Americans, foreign policy, and then I would add women to that as well. So let's go ahead and jump on in. So first of all, what were the reasons for overseas expansion during this time? You're going to see that this is a period where not just in the U.S., but also in Europe, that there is a lot of growth overseas and there is a growth of imperialism during this time. Now, writing about this, a lot of people have written about why there was growth overseas during this period. Frederick Jackson Turner, he's one that the AP exam loves to mention, and he wrote his famous Turner thesis, and in that, he stated that because the frontier was closed, meaning that we had already, as Americans, had already conquered the West, and the West was now fully in our control. There were no native groups there to be fighting anymore, that America was now looking outward because there was no more West to conquer, so now we were looking out throughout the rest of the world. A better reason, I think, for growth during this time is going to be because of economic motives. Again, we were in the middle of the Gilded Age and Industrial Revolution, and the market had really been saturated in a lot of ways here in the United States. So people start to look overseas to other places to sell goods, to make money. On top of that as well, we also needed increased trade with these other countries. We needed trade routes with countries as well. That's going to be another big reason for imperialism, is because of these trade routes. We needed refueling stations in other places. And you're going to see that's why there is so much interest in the Pacific during this time and some of the small islands in that area. Also, competition with Europe. Again, as I said, everybody during this time was really competing in this race for imperialism. And we were definitely competing with Europe during that time, especially where in China, European nations already had, especially England and France, already had established trade there with China. And we kind of, as the new guys, come in and try to like force our way in to being able to trade with China as well. Certainly, there were racial theories behind this as well, most famously publicized through the book White Man's Burden, which talked about it being the white man's burden basically to help civilize the whole entire world. And certainly, there were some people that really wanted to do that. I really do think that money, though, was the primary motivation behind this, as it is a lot of times for things that happen within history. So, that brings us to the Spanish-American War. Again, the Spanish-American War, the reason for that war, really it starts with Cuba. In Cuba, there were Cuban nationalists who wanted their independence from Spain. So they start fighting against Spain, and then that leads Spain to really clamp down on Cuba. Now, Cuban refugees come to the United States, and they catch the attention of Pulitzer and other writers within New York who start writing a lot about what is happening in Cuba. Now, whether or not all that was true, again, a lot of it wasn't exactly true. But you had the New York Times and other papers within New York who were fighting for readership. So they engaged in what is known as yellow journalism. Basically, yellow journalism is you write to try to get people to read it. So the more shocking that something is, the more likely that people tend to pick up that newspaper. We see it today online all the time. Today, we would call it clickbait. That's essentially what yellow journalism is. So you have that, and there's a big push in the U.S. to do everything that we can to help out the Cuban people in fighting against Spain. And then really the big event that is going to change things is going to be the bombing and sinking of the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine had been located in Havana's harbor. It mysteriously explodes, and of course, everybody blames Spain for this. And you get the tagline, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Now looking back on it through history, we realize that actually the Spanish did not blow up this ship. This ship kind of just exploded itself. They believe that hot coals got into where the gunpowder was kept on the ship and blew it up. Again, you're going to see the president at that time, he uses a lot of caution before getting involved in this, but really public opinion in this time was really wanting to go to war with Spain. So we would quickly defeat Spain. As far as the war goes, this would be a very, very easy war, quickly won. You are going to see guys like Teddy Roosevelt, who already had some political fame here in the U.S., at least in New York. He would actually go down and fight there with his famous Rough Riders and get a lot of attention for what they did there. So we do defeat Spain, and as a result of the war, we gain Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, the Philippines is going to be the really interesting one because the Philippines really wanted their independence from Spain. We step in and say, we will help you get that. The only problem is that Americans, we end up staying there. So the Filipino people are not happy about that, and that is going to lead to a long insurrection in the Philippines. And you'd actually see more U.S. soldiers die in the Philippines fighting there versus actually dying in the Spanish-American War. Now, also with this war, you're going to see that this is going to lead to debates between imperialists and anti-imperialists. First of all, people look at this war and they say, we're fighting against Spain for the independence of Cuba. So how did we end up with Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in this? And again, that's solely the imperialist part of it of, hey, we can kind of use this and be able to gain influence in these places. Also, in addition to gaining those places in Cuba, we would gain the military base there, Guantanamo Bay, which you probably are familiar with and have heard of. And we also state the Platt Amendment, which says that we could get involved in Cuba, even though they had their independence, that we could get involved there if we felt it was necessary. So back to that debate between the imperialists, you'll see some of the biggest imperialists during this time are going to be Teddy Roosevelt and President McKinley. And the famous anti-imperialists are going to be guys such as William Jennings Bryan, who kind of becomes like a progressive superstar. Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie actually volunteers the money that the U.S. paid for the Philippines. He volunteers to pay that money back to the U.S. government if they would give the Philippines their independence. Of course, that does not happen. And you would also have the anti-imperialist league as well. I will say with the period of imperialism, look out for political cartoons. When I went through this and taught this to you, I showed in that slides presentation a lot of different political cartoons for imperialism. And that's something that they love to use when talking about imperialism. That brings us to the progressive movement. We kind of hinted at that with the last period, talking about the populist movement. And you're going to see that the populist movement kind of morphs into what the progressive movement does. And basically, the goals of the progressives were to use the government to try to fix some of the issues caused by industrialization and the Gilded Age. So progressives are going to advocate government intervention in the economy. You're going to see that done in a lot of different ways. One of those ways would be through the Meat Inspection Act or the Hepburn Act. If you remember when we talked about the Meat Inspection Act, we read a little bit of a selection from The Jungle, which was a book that was written by Upton Sinclair to try to bring attention to the working conditions in factories, but a lot of people just focused on how nasty the meatpacking industry was. So that's going to lead Teddy Roosevelt, who read that, to push for the Meat Inspection Act. Also, the progressives are going to push to expand democracy with the 17th Amendment, which is direct election of senators. Before this, senators had actually been picked by state legislatures. After the 17th Amendment, now the people voted on senators versus state legislatures. You'd also see the initiative, referendum, and recall. All of those three are specific tools given to the people to have more say in the government. The initiative means that someone takes the initiative to get an issue on the ballot. A citizen does, and then it is voted on. Referendum is where the government puts an issue on the ballot for the people to vote on. I'm thinking about in the past several years, you've seen well, actually not recently, but in the past in California, marijuana legalization, that was something they would put a referendum on the ballot for. And then recall, which right now in 2021, you're going to actually see California is in the process of starting a recall election of their governor. And recall, and again, recall is on state level, not federal. In certain states, you can actually, if you get enough people to sign a petition, you can force a governor or elected official to have to run in an election again, basically a runoff elections. Now, you will see with the progressive era that the progressives tended to be women, middle class, and they tended to live in the cities. Again, we kind of compare this with the populists, but remember the populists were mostly farmers. That's where the populist movement really got its start, was in farmers, but you're going to see progressives do tend to live in the cities. Now, when we're talking about progressives, you did have a progressive party, but realize that both the Democrats and the Republicans had progressive wings during this time. And we talked about this when we talked about the progressives. You'll realize that the progressives weren't totally united on any one issues. You had some progressives that cared really, really strongly about ensuring the rights of African Americans. You had others that cared about women's rights, others that cared about ending child labor. And so really progressives were all over the place, and there was no really one big unifying cause between a lot of them. So that brings us to World War I. Of course, World War I, that pops off over in Europe, and the U.S., our initial response to this is to be neutral and to basically stay out of it in whatever we could. Now, there is the opportunity in wartime to make money, so certainly we were looking into that, and that's why we continued trade with countries over in Europe that was in the middle of the war. Now, President Wilson, after his first time, he will run, and he will run on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," saying he kept us out of World War I. He runs on that slogan, and then what happens? He gets in there, and because of world events going on, especially Germany's propensity for unrestricted submarine warfare, that leads to Wilson to get us involved in World War I. Now, Wilson says that with this, his goal for the United States is to make the world a safe place for democracy. And you'll see that in U.S. propaganda and all kinds of stuff, that's what his goal was. So World War I happens. Of course, when we get into the war, Russia drops out because Russia was going through their own communist revolution at home. We get involved in really it kind of marks a turning point in world history where you see the power of the U.S. government or the U.S. once we get into this war, and kind of how we tip the scales in favor of the Allied powers for the war, and the Allies end up winning it. Now, the United States, we would be very, very heavily involved in the Versailles Treaty or Versailles Peace Conference, and we were very, very involved in the negotiations. Wilson's 14 points that he had issued earlier, basically talking about what he wanted the world to look like after World War I, those actually helped to guide the negotiations and what would end up in the Treaty of Versailles there. Now, another big thing with the Treaty of Versailles is going to be the establishment of the United Nations. I mean, not the United Nations, the League of Nations. The United Nations comes later. Of the League of Nations, which the United States, we are one of the founding members of it, and then we end up not joining. There was a lot of caution in the U.S. and a lot of resistance by Americans who did not want to join the League of Nations. They did not want to join the League of Nations because they feared that if we joined the League of Nations, that would get us involved in another European war, which we were hoping to avoid. So you can see that political cartoon right there showing that the U.S. being a keystone of this League of Nations, and we end up not joining. So because of that, along with a lot of other factors, you are going to see that the League of Nations is really powerless in a lot of ways. Now, probably the greatest legacy of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles is going to be the poor treatment in the treaty towards Germany, basically placing all the responsibility for World War I on Germany. And as a result of that, Germany having to pay reparations, it is going to devastate their economy. There's going to be a lot of resentment there. And I would say, World War I really paved the way for the rise of Hitler and World War II. Now, also during World War I and in the early 20th century, you were going to see the Great Migration, which is the mass movement of African Americans from the South to the North for economic reasons. Again, some of it was to escape the segregation and that kind of thing that was happening in the South. But a lot of this was for economic reasons because in the North is where all the jobs were. Again, the South still didn't have a big manufacturing base. They were still working towards that. And a lot of African Americans saw that their best way to become financially independent and financially secure was to go into the North. So that is the Great Migration. That brings us to the Roaring 20s, the 1920s that we've all heard so much about, where people were having a lot of fun and kind of partying it up during this era. Now, the 1920s, again, economically, things were going really, really well. Unless you were a farmer, things did not go well for farmers. A lot of that is because of the high production levels from World War I. World War I ends, and that leads to an excess of crops left over. So in the 1920s, things were not roaring for the farmers. Now, with the 1920s, you're going to see that is marked by the Red Scare that happens from 1918 to 1920. I previously mentioned that in Russia, they pulled out of World War I because of the Russian Revolution and the Communist Revolution there. And again, that is going to stoke a lot of fears here in the United States about communists infiltrating our government and what that could look like. You'd also see labor unrest here as well, which again is another thing that gets people really, really worried about communists possibly coming and taking over the government. So as the Red Scare happens, basically that is the response of Americans who were scared, and they start targeting radicals and immigrants and saying, hey, we should go after these people, try to kind of like root them out because they could be communists and want to bring down the U.S. government. I think that's best shown in that cartoon that's there with Lady Liberty, and you can see a European anarchist, as he is labeled, coming up behind, ready to kill Lady Liberty there. Now, another thing, as we talked about, during this era, again, you have those new immigrants coming into the country. And for a lot of people, again, a lot of people have been fighting for a long time to restrict the number of immigrants coming into the country. So in the 1920s, you'd have the Quota Acts passed, which were very highly restrictive on immigration. Basically, what it did was set quotas from each country and saying only this number of people can come into the country from there. And really, again, it was targeted at the new immigrants that people had had a lot of distrust and fear of for quite a while. Now, on a more positive note, in the 1920s, you will see a lot of new technologies during this time, improved standard of living. You'd have things like the refrigerator that would come out during this time. Cars, which had been around really since the turn of the century, really explode in growth during this time, as well as you'll see better communication systems with the advent of the radio. Now, the bad thing about a lot of that stuff is a lot of people cannot afford these things without buying them on credit, and buying on credit really becomes a new huge thing for people. Again, throughout history, people have been buying things on credit, but during the 1920s, you're really going to have an explosion of people buying things on credit, especially stocks. People would buy stocks on credit, which is going to be one of those big things that causes issues that gets us into the Great Depression. Now, Some conflicts during the 1920s that you were going to see. Tradition versus innovation. Again, people in the country kind of fighting. We were really in a turning point in history. Think about it. You're going from horses and buggies to cars. So you'll have always that kind of conflict between the new and the old. Also, fundamentalist Christianity versus scientific modernism. This is best shown with the Scopes monkey trial, as it was known, where a Tennessee teacher is put on trial for teaching evolution because in Tennessee at that time, it was illegal for a teacher to teach evolution. He ends up going to trial, and the Scopes monkey trial would be the first ever trial that you would see that would actually be broadcast on the radio for Americans to see. And the trial, in a lot of ways, is kind of going to be a joke because basically, in a lot of ways, it kind of turns into arguments of Christianity versus evolution during this time. Also, you're going to see during this time, as we already mentioned with the Quota Acts, the native-born versus the new immigrants and that tension there, as well as you're going to see white versus black and what is known as the Red Summer. The Red Summer is best known for having a lot of race riots, not in the South, but actually in the North. Most famously in Chicago, you would have race riots that would occur there, where you'd have African Americans killed as a result of that. And then idealism versus disillusionment. Again, with everything that was roaring and how things were going economically in the 1920s, a lot of people had a lot of idealism about them and said, hey, America's doing great. Our trajectory is heading really great, and this is a great thing. You did have people such as the lost generation of writers who were very, very disillusioned by what was happening and said all of this materialism and everything that is happening during the 1920s, it is not good for society. I think that's best shown if you look at F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which you may have read this year. Again, really that was written as a critique of all the materialism and kind of the fakeness that you saw in culture of that time. Also, you'd see the stock market crash of 1929 happen as well. Another thing about the 1920s to remember is that in 1919, women would get the right to vote. So that's going to be a big change for the 1920s. But also, you're going to see the passage of prohibition as well. So this time in the 1920s, when everybody's kind of living it up, you were going to see that as a time when there should not have been any alcohol around because of prohibition, but alcohol was still readily available if you had the means in order to be able to acquire it. So again, that brings us to the stock market crash of 1929, which a lot of people kind of unofficially mark as the beginning of the Great Depression. And you're going to see Herbert Hoover is going to be the president at that time. And Herbert Hoover is going to basically try everything that he kind of could. He tries working with the private sector to try to pull us out of the Great Depression, and nothing kind of seemed to work. And another notable thing about the Great Depression is that this is going to be a worldwide depression. It's not just going to be the U.S. It is going to be a worldwide depression. Here in the U.S., though, you're going to see that by the time FDR comes into office, that you have a quarter of people in the U.S. Without jobs, and things were not getting any better. So another part of the 1920s that you will see is the Harlem Renaissance. We didn't mention that over there, but that's, again, with the Great Migration, you're going to have a lot of African Americans that move into Harlem, New York. And within there, they call this the Harlem Renaissance because you're going to see a lot of writings and music and all kinds of stuff, poetry come out of Harlem. And that's why it is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Guys such as Louis Armstrong, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, all of them having a big influence in this Harlem Renaissance, a kind of celebration of African American culture. So, the New Deal. FDR gets elected. Again, Hoover would only serve one term. A lot of people felt like that he didn't really do anything to help out with the Great Depression. So FDR comes in promising a new deal. The old deal was what Hoover had done and wasn't working. And you're going to see a lot of what he does is actually influenced by progressive ideals, but it is also influenced by the new economic theories of the day, which basically said, hey, we should use government spending to help promote and push the economy up, especially when the economy is down. So with the New Deal, it is focused on relief, recovery, and reform. Those are the 3 R's of the New Deal. And you're going to see that with the New Deal, all of these different programs kind of fall in under that. Now, the legacy of the New Deal is you're going to see really it changes the role of the government in the economy. Previously to this, the economy or the government had been very laissez-faire. Now, that had changed a little bit during the progressive movement with the government getting more involved in like child labor and that kind of stuff. But overall, the government had a very lazy they had a very lazy attitude kind of towards being involved in the economy. Now you're going to see that with the New Deal that it's basically going to be anti-laissez-faire. Now the government is going to be very, very much in the economy. And this is important because basically since World War or since the New Deal, you're going to see that the U.S. government has been very, very involved in the economy. An example that I always use is last year we have the pandemic that happens, and what is one of the first things the government does? They issue stimulus checks to help out people, and now they've done 2 more since then. So again, this fundamental philosophy change in how the U.S. government operated during this time. And again, this isn't something that's just like in a U.S. bubble. This is something that was also happening in Europe as well. Now, conservatives sought to limit the New Deal and worried about the government getting too out of control with what they were doing. Of course, the Supreme Court would actually step in and veto or find unconstitutional some of the things that FDR had done. So FDR kind of has to pivot with what he is doing and go through Congress and do some different things to get those actually passed. One of the ways, though, that FDR does initially respond to the Supreme Court, finding what he did unconstitutional, is threatening to pack the court. Now, as far as packing the court goes, again, packing the court was very, very unpopular with the American people, so that basically gets dropped as soon as he comes up with the idea. You'll see that others do call for more reforms during this time and felt like that more should be done to help out the economy. But again, a lot was already being done already. So what were the impacts of the New Deal? You're going to see that many of the agencies that were created are still around. The FDIC, which was meant to encourage people to have trust in banks again, because a lot of banks had gone under and taken people's money with it. So the FDIC was created. Social Security, which was supposed to be a temporary program to help out older and what we would consider retirees today, is obviously still around today. Now, speaking of these agencies, make sure that you are familiar with a handful of the agencies. When we went through this, I gave you some examples of some of these New Deal agencies. But again, just be familiar with some of those in case there is a short answer question and they do ask for examples of things that FDR did with the New Deal to try to help pull us out of that. Now, other impacts of the New Deal, it did not completely overcome the Great Depression. And that is where you are going to see there is a lot of debate on whether the New Deal actually worked. Yes, you are going to see unemployment come down a little bit, but there are some people that feel like the New Deal actually prolonged the Great Depression a lot longer than it did, and that the true thing that brought us out of the Great Depression would be the wartime spending with World War II. Again, I think that tends to be an argument that really is influenced by your own political views. But again, that's an argument that you will see. I know that we did a short answer question about this in class, kind of evaluating it with that. But did the New Deal actually work? I will say, though, with FDR in kind of his defense, that he gave the American people hope at a time when a lot of people felt really, really hopeless. Other impacts of the New Deal, you are going to see a change in voting during this time. To this point in history, typically African Americans had voted for the Republican Party because that was the party of Lincoln. And during this time, you're going to see African Americans and unions begin to support the Democratic Party. And this is what is going to be known as the New Deal Coalition. This shift towards groups that had previously voted maybe Republican, now becoming solidly Democratic voters. All right, that brings us to World War II. Again, of course, the United States would be neutral until Pearl Harbor. Again, we put that neutral in quotation marks because we start out very, very opposed to getting in the war. And then the U.S. government realizes, hey, we can actually make some money by getting involved in the war. So we do begin to help out the Allies in several specific ways through like the Lend-Lease Act and the Destroyers for Bases deal. But we would be officially neutral until Pearl Harbor happens in December of 1941. Once Pearl Harbor happens, we are full-fledged in the war. Now, as I mentioned previously, in the slide before this, the mass mobilization and the mass war effort with World War II is going to be what really pulls us out of the Great Depression. And you're going to see that because of World War II, that it does open up a lot of opportunities for women and African Americans, because again, mostly white men were off fighting in the war, which left shortages in factories. And you start having women such as the Rosie the Riveters working in the factories, and the same for African Americans. You also will see that during this time, and this is something that is one of their favorite things to put on the AP exam, you will have encouragement, immigration encouraged from Mexico with the Bracero program, which was basically a way that Mexican workers could come to the United States legally and work on the farms here in the Bracero program. So you have those opportunities and growth as well. Now, home front experiences for the Japanese, especially on the home front was not a good experience. You would have FDR who would sign an executive order, and that basically, that executive order allowed for Japanese Americans to be put in internment camps. Again, there was this big fear in the United States that there were a ton of Japanese spies here. And again, those fears come from what had happened at Pearl Harbor. So in response to that, FDR issues that, which makes internment camps. Now, again, remember, internment camps are not concentration camps. They are basically high security prisons, you could say, where Japanese were put. You can see on that map there showing where some of these internment camps were, mostly on the West Coast. This executive order in Korematsu versus the United States would be upheld by the U.S. government. Now, one thing, again, I have seen this on the AP exam several times, is they like to compare Japanese internment to Lincoln's actions during the Civil War. FDR, again, interning the Japanese Americans and restricting their rights. And during the Civil War, you would have Lincoln who would suspend habeas corpus, which meant that he could have prisoners and hold them indefinitely, which is essentially what was happening with FDR in the internment camps. So just be aware of those comparisons there. Again, that is one of the things that they do a lot on the AP exam, is kind of comparing and contrasting between items or events that happened within different periods. Now, how did the U.S. and the Allies win? One, political and military occupation. Again, we would engage in the Atlantic Charter, where we worked specifically with Great Britain and the Soviet Union. So we had that cooperation. Industrial production, that is going to be a huge one for us. If you think about it, during and both after World War II, the United States is going to be the only area that outside of Pearl Harbor and a little bit of action off of the Outer Banks of the United States, again, our factories were untouched. So once we get in the war, we are really able to jumpstart and grow our industrial machine, you could say. And again, that industrial production is really, really going to tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. You'd also have advancements in technology and science during this time. Again, a ton of scientific advancements that you are going to see, but especially you will see the Manhattan Project, which is what develops the atomic bomb, which is going to be the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs will be what drops or what ends the war in the Pacific theater of the war. Now, after World War II, again, we emerge as a superpower. Again, both Europe and Asia were in bad shape as a result of World War II. So we engage as a superpower, again, because we didn't have to rebuild factories or anything like that. And again, we emerge as this big superpower, and this is going to get us into period 8, which is the start of the Cold War. So let's jump over here to the people that you need to know, some names that you should be familiar with period 7. Frederick Jackson Turner. I've already talked about him in the Turner thesis, which again provided some reasoning for why people were expanding out west. I did not mention him in the period slides here, but Alfred Thayer Mahan, he writes The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. This was a super influential book. It would influence Teddy Roosevelt, who read it, and many others. And basically what he encouraged in that was building up your navies, each country building up their navies and seeing the oceans more or the seas more as highways versus barriers. And he really encouraged not only building up the Navy, but overseas trade as well, and having refueling areas in these places around the world. Rudyard Kipling, he is the one who writes A White Man's Burden, which we mentioned before, that justifies imperialism. With the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, I already mentioned him, how he resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in order to fight in the war as part of the Rough Riders. William McKinley, he would be the president during the Spanish-American War. You'll see him oftentimes portrayed in political cartoons having to do with imperialism. Now, we talked about in the Philippines how they were fighting against the Spanish, and then they fought against us when they realized they weren't going to get their independence. Emilio Aguinaldo, he is the one that led those Filipino independence forces there in the Philippines. The Anti-Imperialist League, again, I already mentioned them and their resistance to imperialism, especially in the Philippines. Now, progressive movement. With that, some of the writers to know, I mentioned Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. Jacob Riis, he is another and very important one to know. He wrote How the Other Half Lives. And with that, basically what he had done is gone around and took pictures of the conditions that people were living in as a result of the Gilded Age. He took pictures of child labor, people living on the streets, how many people were packed into apartments. And again, this is one of those things that brought a lot of people's attention to how bad things were in certain areas of society. Lincoln Steffens would write The Shame of Cities, again, talking about the poor living conditions within cities. I mentioned with the 1920s and the 19-teens, how you did have women getting the right to vote. Alice Paul would be one of those who fights for women's right to vote and is key and instrumental in pushing the 19th Amendment. You would also have John Muir. He is more around the turn of the century period, somebody that had a good friendship with Teddy Roosevelt. He founds the Sierra Club, which is a preservationist organization, and he takes a lot of pictures of areas like Yellowstone and Yosemite and takes pictures of these to show people and really influences Teddy Roosevelt in creating the National Park Service and having all of these protected lands here in the U.S. World War I, again, President Wilson's the one in charge of that. He is the one that kept us out of war, but then gets us involved in the war. And again, his ideals behind getting us involved in World War I was wanting to preserve democracy or make basically democracy ready for the rest of the world. George Creel, he was a journalist. He did these 4-minute speeches to support the war. Again, just another idea of how people were involved in supporting the war effort and how the U.S. uses propaganda during World War I to get people behind the war. Charles Schenck, he's going to be very, very important. We'll mention this case again when we talk about the court cases, but he was arrested and convicted of violating the Espionage Act of 1917, basically because he spoke out against the war. And you're going to see his conviction is upheld by the U.S. Again, we're going to talk about that Supreme Court case in a little bit more detail here in a minute. Henry Cabot Lodge, he is going to be one of the people who is against the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and is going to be very, very influential in getting the American people feeling the same way, but also getting the U.S. Senate not to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Mitchell Palmer, we talked about the Red Scare and the fear of communism after World War I. Palmer is going to be the one that leads the Palmer Raids in 1919, which leads to the Red Scare, and basically what he was trying to do was root out communists. The Harlem Renaissance, we already mentioned that, the celebration of African-American culture and some of the leaders of that. Another African-American leader during this time is going to be Marcus Garvey, and he is going to be very, very instrumental in promoting the Back to Africa movement. Basically, he said that he felt like African-Americans would never catch a fair deal here in the United States and pushed for African-Americans to move back over to Africa. He is actually going to be a huge influence on the later Malcolm X. Scopes, we already talked about him, the Tennessee teacher that taught evolution, was put on trial, found guilty and convicted for doing that. But really, the bigger part of that is it leads to a nationwide discussion on evolution. And then the Lost Generation, again, that's the one that kind of criticized how life was during the 1920s and all the materialism and everything else that was happening during that period. Now, with the Great Depression New Deal, the bonus army. Under President Hoover, these were World War I veterans that marched on Washington, D.C., basically in response to the Great Depression. They wanted to get their bonus payments early. As soldiers, they were entitled to that, but they wanted it early. And Herbert Hoover would send in the National Guards and others. You would have several of these killed, of this bonus army killed. And basically, again, it's kind of a public relations nightmare for Hoover in this. And again, gets a lot of people criticizing Hoover and feeling like he didn't care about the American people during the Great Depression. Of course, FDR, with the New Deal and the 3 R's, Dr. Francis Townsend, he's going to be one that advocates and pushes for Social Security and that $200 a month to the elderly, which of course we know becomes a permanent government program. And we mentioned the political realignment that would happen with African Americans and the working class beginning to vote Democratic after the Great Depression. During World War II, A. Philip Randolph, he is going to propose a march on Washington, and you're going to see that with FDR's New Deal programs, that a lot of times that these programs treated whites and blacks differently. A. Philip Randolph and others are going to be ones that pushes to that ending. FDR's own wife, Eleanor, would be big in pushing him to say, hey, let's stop the separation and the segregation between whites and blacks in how we are doing these New Deal programs. Of course, women during this time worked a lot in factories, and you have the picture there of Rosie the Riveter. Also with African Americans during World War II, another area, the area that they're going to push for equality is just overall just in factories and how they were being treated. And they did that through what was known as the Double V campaign, which meant victory in Europe or victory abroad and victory here at home, meaning we beat the Nazis and the Japanese, and then we bring equality here to the U.S. We mentioned the Japanese Americans and how 100,000 of them were put in internment camps, and then Mexican Americans with the Bracero program, but you would also have the Zoot Suit riots, which happened out west. As a result, Mexican Americans would wear these suits that were made of a lot of fabric. Some Americans, especially servicemen, saw this as anti-patriotic because they weren't conserving, and that leads to riots there where you will have some Mexican Americans beat up and harassed as a result of that. So jumping lastly over here to the court cases that we're going to mention. I talked about Schenck versus the United States here, and why is this Supreme Court case so important? Well, in this, the Supreme Court sets the precedent of the clear and present danger test. So basically what this says is that your First Amendment rights, your freedom of speech, can be limited at certain times if it does pose a clear and present danger. And the famous example that they give is you can't shout fire in a crowded theater because that can lead to harm to people, and so they can restrict your First Amendment freedom of speech in that. Of course, Schenck had been tried under the Espionage Act for things that he had said about World War I and was found guilty. So with this, the Supreme Court found that in times of war and crisis, certain civil liberties do decrease. And again, they connect that, or you can connect that yourself to Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus and even to FDR and what he did with the internment camps. And again, if this sounds familiar to you, when we talk about the Espionage Act during World War I, you could go all the way back to President John Adams, our second president, in his Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed as tension was building with France, and kind of connect those two as well. The next case, again, you're going to see that with the Supreme Court and the New Deal, or with the New Deal, that there is going to be a lot of hesitancy to some of the New Deal programs, especially the NRA program, the National Recovery Act, not the National Rifle Organization, but the National Recovery Act. In two cases, Butler versus U.S., that would declare the Agricultural Adjustment Administration unconstitutional, and Schechter Poultry versus the U.S. declared the NIRA unconstitutional. And that is going to be what leads FDR to propose the court packing plan that never actually happens. But just know that there was resistance to what was happening with the New Deal with conservatives in Congress and in the Supreme Court. That brings us to the internment of Japanese during World War II. Of course, as I already told you, Korematsu versus the United States. That would be the case that would be brought all the way to the Supreme Court, challenging the legality of internment camps. And the Supreme Court, in one of those decisions that people say were really, really bad, they upheld the legality of FDR's executive order. And again, because of that fear that people had of the Japanese here. Again, there was no evidence of Japanese actually spying in the United States. And again, most of the people put internment camps were actually people who had Japanese ancestry but had been here for a couple of generations already. And again, what is the impact of this case? It shows that rights can be limited during war. Thankfully, though, we have learned by this, and hopefully we don't repeat this again, but you never know because it is history. So that brings us to the end of this and talking about period 7. Again, a very, very important period in U.S. history. Next class, we will do our last video, which is talking about periods 8 and 9, which covers the Cold War and then how things changed at the late 20th century and in the early 21st century with the end of the Cold War. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. This is just designed to be a tool to give you a brief kind of overview of everything and kind of rekindle some of those names and court cases and other things that you could then use on the AP exam in a DBQ or in a short answer question or whatever. So again, let me know if you have any questions and have a fantastic day.